Hello. Happy Monday. I don't really know what day it is. I'm having tech issues, hence why I'm 10 minutes late. Sorry about that. Everybody who's been waiting at 2 o'clock, and these things sometimes happen. I feel like we should be calling this session difficult tech days rather than difficult conversations, because that's kind of how it's been a little bit today. But I'm here now and it's great to be with you. So I'm talking today about difficult conversations. Why do we have to have them? How do we do them? What do we need to do to make sure that, they're not too horrendous? Personally, I'm sure I'm not the only one who hates having a difficult conversation. Oh my God, I've got way too many things going on here. All right. But we do need to have them over the course of work and life. And some of the reasons that we need to have difficult conversations include ending a relationship, or dealing with a family conflict. At work, difficult conversations can arise around personal things like mental health, political opinions with people whose views are not the same as yours, and my favorite, menopause and health issues. Why don't we talk about that more in the workplace? Because it's a difficult conversation to have, that's why. Next week, on the Wednesday, the 18th of October, is World Menopause Day. So if you're looking for a reason to talk about menopause in your workplace, next Wednesday gives it to you on a platter. I'd love to see more conversations about that. But other things that we have hard conversations about or struggle with are feedback. I feel that one of the questions I get asked more than almost any other when it comes to having difficult conversations, particularly at work, is how do I give feedback when it's not great? Or how do I tell one of my staff or my boss or one of my colleagues that I don't like how they're doing a particular thing, or I don't like what they've said, or I don't agree with them? All of these things come up every day in workplaces, and it can be really difficult. It can conversations. Let's face it, it can be really easy to run from these conversations because they're hard, and our primitive brain likes us to fight or flight or freeze when it comes to hard things, and difficult conversations are one of those hard things. So we often haven't been taught how to have a difficult conversation, which is why they can be hard. I look at some of my friends and the families that they've been brought up in, and so many of them just didn't have the hard conversations growing up because their parents didn't know how. And so if you haven't grown up in an environment where open and honest and difficult and tricky conversations are the norm, then it can be really difficult to start to have to do those as an adult, because you don't know how. You haven't got that muscle of how to have a difficult conversation in a way that's clear and compassionate. And that's what it comes down to, clarity and compassion. The other reasons we find really difficult conversations can be hard is because we don't know what the outcome will be. I'll never forget when I was years ago, when I was in government, I was acting in a role and I didn't get it when it was, and when the process, I didn't get it. And my boss called me into his office and he said, "Got some bad news for you." And my first thought was, oh, how do I tell him I don't want the job? And I thought, no, hang on, that's not bad news to him. So he told me I didn't get the job. I felt this overwhelming sense of relief for heaps of different reasons. But he said to me later, "You're taking this really well." I said, how did you expect me to take it? Thinking, I've worked with you for a long time. We've got a really good relationship. And he said, well, the last person who I had to tell didn't get the job that they'd been acting in for ages threw a chair at me. And so, unsurprisingly, when he got to have the difficult conversation with me, telling me I didn't get this job, he was very unsure about how I would respond, because he also didn't expect his other person to throw a chair at him. I'd love to pause. He never told me, so I was very disappointed about that. Well, I do, yes. But, difficult conversations can be really intense, and A lot of us are really bad when it comes to naming our emotions and having conversations that involve emotions, particularly the emotion that is around there is happy, sad, and mad. And most of us are really good at naming happy, sad, and mad as our emotions, but anything more sophisticated than that can be challenging. And so that's another reason why hard conversations are hard. But as leaders, it's really important that we know how to have a hard conversation, because we have to come up against them all the time for things like conflict resolution, encouraging open and honest conversation, particularly when there's changes happening in our organization, whether it's a formalized change process or whether it's change because of things like COVID. I'm imagining that there's a lot of, well, I know I don't need to imagine, there's a lot of really hard conversations happening in workplaces at the moment around returning into the office, and people who don't want to and who don't think they need to. But, organizational policies are changing. And so there's a lot of people having these challenging conversations. The other thing when it comes to knowing how to have a hard conversation is the better you can do it, the more you'll build trust. And at the end of the day, business relationships are predicated on trust, and communication is all about trust. So if you need to have a hard conversation with someone, it will be a whole lot easier if you've already got a trusting relationship with that person or with those people. I'll never forget the time a client said to me, I need to communicate to a large part of our workforce that that part of the business has been sold. And I don't know how to do that because they're like a family. We're like a family. We get on really well. And the worst part of this decision to sell this part of the business is that I'm not going with the business. I'm staying in the original company. And he said, how do I do that? How do I have that really difficult conversation? And I said to him, you just have to be honest. You need to know your facts, honest. And I said, don't be afraid of showing your emotion. And when I rang him a few days after he'd had this conversation, I said, how was it? And he said, it was nowhere near as awful as I thought. He said, everybody cried, including me. And I said, that just shows how much you love them, and they'll know that and they'll remember that and appreciate that. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that you cry with every hard conversation, but when there's strong emotions involved, sometimes you do, and we need to normalize that as well. The other thing that I want to just talk about is when we have hard conversations, they can prevent problems from escalating. I worked with somebody, again, a long time ago who in my quarterly feedback, might have been 6 monthly feedback review, she said to me, you've been doing this thing that really annoys me, or months ago you did this thing that really annoyed me. And she never told me what it was at the time. And when she was telling me in my review, I couldn't actually remember doing the thing that I had apparently done. And she had let that fester and fester and fester in her mind until it became, this massive big thing that she just didn't know how to deal with. So you need to have, big conversations, have them when things happen. Don't wait. So I want to specifically talk about feedback. And as leaders, we need to give and receive feedback all the time. We're often taught how to give feedback, but we're not often taught how to receive it. And receiving feedback can be as scary, if not more scary, than giving feedback. There's Gallup a couple of years ago shared that 99% of employees want feedback, but only 75% of managers don't like giving it. And they don't like giving it because they don't know what the outcome will be, because they're not prepared, and because they don't want to be what they believe is the bearer of bad news. But when you give feedback well, and when you have, when you listen to both sides of the feedback loop, because feedback is a two-way thing, then it can really lead to opportunities for better professional growth and development. And again, we're resistant to having these conversations, whether it's feedback or whether it's other hard conversations, because we don't want to hurt people's feelings. We don't want to give bad news, and we're scared of the potential bad reaction. But at the end of the day, the way that we give and receive feedback conversations or any difficult conversations all boils down to communication. And communication is about relationships and trust. So if you're needing to have that hard conversation, whether it's with, a colleague or an employee or a friend or a family member or your partner, think about the strength of the relationship that you have with that person. And the stronger the relationship and the more trust you have in that relationship, the more understanding that other person should be of the fact that you're putting yourself out there to have this difficult conversation. There's so many organizations today and relationships in general that have massive issues. And one of the reasons I believe for these massive issues is because we don't know how to communicate. We don't take the time to communicate, and we don't have the courage to have conversations that can be really difficult for one or both parties. So, and one of the reasons is because when somebody says, I need to talk to you about, or can you come into my office, or we need to talk, my personal favorite, not, our brain is wired to automatically think the worst. Our brain is automatically expected to have, goes to this negativity bias where we think that the worst is going to be said and the worst is going to happen. And this is because, as psychologist Rick Hanson says, our brains are wired to scout for the bad stuff. And so we fixate on the threat. So how do we overcome that? Well, it's not the easiest thing to overcome. But in terms of overcoming it, then, we need to be better at asking for these challenging conversations, and we need to be better at not assuming the worst every time we have to have one. I don't really have any simple answers or remedies for that, because it's not always easy. But if you, for example, are wanting to have a conversation with one of your staff and you send them an email, don't just say in the email, have you got 5 minutes for a quick chat? Say, have you got 5 minutes for a quick chat? And then in brackets afterwards, say everything's good, or maybe say what that chat's about, so that they don't then spend the rest of, the next however long before the chat automatically thinking the worst. How do we preface that not all conversations are going to be negative? As the starter of these difficult conversations, we need a responsibility. We need to take a responsibility to make sure that the person who we are asking to have the conversation with doesn't walk in scared. Because when you walk into a conversation scared, it's not going to end well for anybody, because it takes a long time to calm that fear mechanism and that scared mechanism. So I do have a 5-step framework, which I'll really quickly run through. I try to keep these little lives to 15 minutes, and we're at 12 and a half. So I'll whip it through this. If you'd like a copy of my framework, I'll hold it up. Just pop me a note and send me a DM, and I'm really happy to send it to you. So the first part of the framework is connect. The more we connect with the people that we're having the hard conversations with, and the more we're connected to ourselves, the easier those conversations will be. So if you hate having difficult conversations, then ask yourself why. Why is that? What has happened in my past that makes me dislike these conversations? And what stories am I telling myself about why they're difficult? What are my triggers that help me recognize that it doesn't always need to be, end badly? The second thing we need to be doing is setting the scene. How and where are you having these difficult conversations? For a long time, when my stepson was young, and I would always want to know what was happening in his world, we weren't so much having difficult conversations. Well, they weren't difficult for me. I think they may have been for him. I'd always get him to do the dishes with me. And so I'd wash, he'd dry, I'd ask him one question, and then he would just talk and talk and talk. And the reason for that was because we were focused on doing something else rather than the conversation. I always also quite like to have, the difficult conversations when I'm in the car, because the other person can't escape. My husband hates flying with me and sitting next to me because he says I always ask him the hard questions when we're at 30,000 feet in a plane and he can't go anywhere. So he now frequently will say, when we're checking in, can I sit away from her? I've definitely got form. Anyway, it makes me laugh. But set the scene. If you know that you need to have a difficult conversation with someone, can you go somewhere neutral that's not your space or their space? Can you go for a walk together? I've always found that walking meetings and walking conversations are far easier to have those honest conversations, because you're not looking at each other as you might be across a desk. And there's no power imbalance when you're going for a walk. You're all, or when you're, doing an activity together, which makes it a lot easier. The third step is focus on the facts. Try not to let the emotion get involved, but try to be factual. And if you're giving feedback conversation, then focus specifically on what it is that you're wanting to impart, what information you're wanting to impart, and what those facts are. And, as Brene Brown says, clear is kind. The more clarity that you can use, and the more compassion that you can use, and the more empathy that you can use when you're having difficult conversations, then the easier it will be for everybody. Be clear that the intent as well, with feedback in particular, be clear that the intent is to help people improve. It's not a personal attack. It's about how can you do the thing in a different way to get a better outcome, or in a better way to get a different outcome. You pick. Fourth is ask, listen, and observe. Ask questions. If you're having a difficult conversation, maybe preface it by saying, this is hard for me. How do you feel about this? What are you thinking about it? Listen to their answers. Observe behaviors, particularly in a work environment where people can be nervous when they have to have a talk with the boss, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. There's a level of anxiety that can come in. So think about how you can put that person on the front foot and make them feel more comfortable about the situation and the conversation. And then finally, set future goals, particularly with a feedback conversation. What are you going to do to ensure improvement, commitment, growth, and development? And if you need to have a difficult conversation with a friend or a family member, again, what's the future focus? What do you want out of the conversation? What are you going to do in the future to make it easier and better to do the thing that you need to have the difficult conversation about? So that's about it for me today. Thank you so much for watching, listening. If you have any questions, pop them below. I will just do a quick final plug for my Thriving Leaders program. It starts next week, the week of the 16th of October. The link is below and I'll pop it in the comments as well. But Thriving Leaders is an 8-week program for female leaders who are feeling stuck, wanting to improve how they communicate, wanting to get more energy. Talk a lot about conversations and relationships, and how do you increase your self-awareness so that you can have a better understanding of how you're perceived, but also how you what your values and priorities are. And these are all related to having difficult conversations. We talk about hard decisions as well. How do you make a hard decision? That's a topic for another day. But yeah, I'd love you to join me on Thriving Leaders. If you have any questions about that, pop them in the chat or in the comments, or shoot me a DM. I'm really happy to help however I can with answering questions about that. But yeah, I'd love to see you if it's something that you're interested in. Alrighty, have a great afternoon, and I'll be back I think Wednesday at 2 o'clock. See you on the lives on whatever platform you're on: Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Instagram. See you then. Bye.